Thank you, Brianna. So my name is a little peculiar. It's pronounced Sala, like c'est la vie. And Rebecca's last name is pronounced Acre. So that's a little different. So I'm thankful to be here, and I am not sure if Rebecca has joined. Hopefully she'll be able to join us at the very end if she's not here during the presentation. So let's get started. I am not a gambler, but I bet you have experienced this situation. The situation in which the student approaches the reference desk or the chat queue and they say, "Help, I cannot use any of these sources in my bibliography." Thus begins the process of the librarian critically reading their bibliography and critically reading their assignment directions, looking for obvious problems. Critical reading happens all throughout the library all day long. It's something that librarians do as part of our job on a daily basis. Across campus, in the classroom, and I am calling librarians the people that work underneath the library heading in the organization chart, even if many of us have faculty status and teach, and I'm calling teaching faculty those that work in the discipline-specific realm, just for the purposes of this presentation. So librarians are critically reading all throughout the day, and across campus in the discipline classroom, specifically the psychology classroom, professors are teaching students how to critically read empirical research articles. But back in the library realm, librarians are teaching the students how to find those critical articles. Yet, something still happens. Students still have problems locating pertinent information. They end up with non-academic sources. They have the wrong types of documents. They have a bunch of resources about their topic, but they're not cohesive or pertinent, and they have difficulties writing their papers. They have the wrong methodologies. They have the wrong search terms, so they end up with low search results. And just overall, we see poor search results and limited search skills on a daily basis. So my question for you is, do you see these same types of problems at your institutions, at your reference desk, in your chat queues? And if, Brianna, if they're able to, may they comment on this in the chat? Okay. I see some answers coming in. Yes, constantly, all the time. Yes, 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 and many, many more yeses. So I think we're all on the same page here, is that this is happening across campuses. So in addition to the problems we've all experienced, all these that we're saying absolutely about and all the time, professors, teaching faculty, place additional restrictions on assignments for students. And we are all familiar with these, particularly in the psychology realm. They often say they have to be empirical research studies. They have to be published in the last, say, 5 years or 10 years. They have to be a certain type of research study. We all see the times where professors say must be quantitative and can't be qualitative. Other times they want qualitative and not quantitative. Sometimes they want literature reviews, sometimes they don't. And almost always, absolutely no encyclopedias, no Wikipedia, and don't you love the one, no internet source. So we get these things all the time. So this was happening to me on a regular basis. And in addition to those problems that the students were experiencing, we have one professor that puts another limit to the type of articles that she wants. And this is what actually led me to be interested in the idea of critical reading and why I'm actually here today. So this particular professor, in both her writing and psychology class and in her a lot of her human development and aging services classes, she requires, in addition to the empirical research article, she puts another level to that, and she calls it a primary research article versus a secondary research article. So students were coming to the reference desk saying, is this a primary research article? I was getting emails from the faculty and from students, the faculty would forward them to me and say, please meet with Sala and she will help you find a primary research article. So this was happening over and over and over. And that kind of started, I guess, about 2.5 years ago that I was experiencing this. And so the students would come in and I would look at their articles, and it was very clear that the answer to their question was right there in the abstract for the article or in the methodology. So the way this professor defines primary research article, she says that the authors of the study have to be the ones that developed the data. It cannot be any type of national survey. So, for example, when students are writing about teen suicide, a lot of the articles that they find are actually studies that are on national suicide data. And she didn't want anything like that. She just wanted the authors of the study to have created the data and then analyzed the data. That's what she calls a primary research article. Now, for me, and I'll be curious to see what you guys think about this when we can talk at the end. To me, the idea of a primary source is a history source, the Treaty of Ghent, and then maybe a secondary source about the Treaty of Ghent, or the Declaration of Independence is a primary source. And in a literature classroom, the primary source would be the novel, and the secondary source would be the critiques about it, or the poem would be the primary source, and then the critiques about it. I had not heard a professor use the term primary research article in psychology, and it was really throwing some of the students for a loop. But again, it was clearly there in the abstract if they would just read it. So at about that time, that was going on semester after semester. And I guess about a year ago, in my inbox arrived a call for chapter proposals for an ACRL book about critical reading. And it was specifically about critical reading in the relation to information literacy. And I thought, I think I can do something with this. Let me research how we can teach students to critically read these important sources that will help them find the most pertinent sources. So that said, let's get a working definition for what is critical reading. So the editors of the upcoming ACRL book asked all of the authors to use the definition of critical reading from this title, Critical Reading in Higher Education. It is by Karen Manarin, Miriam Carey, Melanie Rathburn, and Glenn Ryland. And they define critical reading as reading for academic purposes and reading for civic engagement. So I honed in on the academic purposes part of that definition. And the components of reading for academic purposes include identifying patterns of textual elements, distinguishing between main and subordinate ideas, and evaluating credibility. So that is the definition we were charged to use. And so I was thinking about all of those sources that students needed to critically read in order to find the pertinent resources, and I decided to call them a pre-source. So what is a pre-source? Now, to my knowledge, the word pre-source is not defined in this ALA glossary. I just put that up as an image because I needed that. I have not actually laid hands on that book and looked it up, but I needed an image. So to me, a pre-source is any source that aids in selecting, using, and critically analyzing information resources prior to obtaining the desired information source. Pre-sources include, but they are not limited to, database descriptions, which I call scope notes in this presentation, brief citations, full citations, abstracts, help sheets, thesauri, and indexes. So, I am not a gambler, but I bet that critically reading pre-sources will solve these common problems. If students would critically read scope notes, brief records, document type fields, they would know whether or not they have a non-academic source. If they would critically read brief citations and the source type and full records and specific fields, they would know if they had the right type of document. If they will critically read subject fields and thesauri and controlled vocabulary, they'll know if their resources are pertinent. If they will critically read abstracts and scan for key phrases, they can identify those primary research articles versus the secondary research articles. If they critically read the author index, the thesauri, and have the right controlled vocabulary, they will find good sources because they'll be using the right terms. And overall, if they have poor search results, they need to critically read the help sheets. So, what does the library literature say about reading or teaching the pre-source? It doesn't say very much at all. One 30-year-old gem from Reference Services Review reminds us of the importance of the pre-source when they say, classroom discussion needs to emphasize that informed critical choices at the citation level must be made by the students themselves if they are to obtain the information they need. I believe we can all agree that's definitely true. In Teaching Critical Thinking in Psychology, Dunn mentions a pre-source indicating, in reading the abstract, students must be able to apply critical analysis skills to determine whether an article is likely to be related to their research topic. I think we can all agree with that too. So, the library literature says just a little bit. I mean, like I said, that first reference is 30 years old. But luckily for us, both the education literature, the psychology literature, the scientific literature is full of articles about teaching how to critically read the empirical research article. So that is where our connection is. We can learn about teaching how to critically read the empirical research article and apply that to our field, library science. So, you might say, what is the big deal? Critical reading is easy, right? I mean, it comes natural to probably most of us. After all, we work in a world of information. But it is easy to librarians because we live and play in the formal world of citations, abstracts, and empirical research articles. Our formal world is very, very different from the student world. Pre-sources, citations, full records, fields, thesauri, help sheets, they are very different from clips and posts and tweets and talks. While both of these worlds have textual elements, ours is structured and theirs is informal. Ours is coded and theirs is visual. Ours is static and theirs is moving. Ours has alphanumeric, elements, and theirs is narrative. It is very, very different. So, there are common challenges of pre-sources in relation to the empirical research article. The challenges that students face when reading the empirical research article include there are non-narrative components. And think about a database full record. Think about a MARC record or an OCLC record. Not that students are looking at OCLC records, but imagine the MARC record and the numbers that are involved. Imagine a full Medline record. They have non-narrative components. They're an unfamiliar format. They have chart-like two-letter codes with colons and space and then words that they don't understand. They have abbreviations. They have unfamiliar vocabulary. They're full of library and publishing jargon. They have acronyms they've not heard of, and they have fluidity stoppers. Some research indicates that even APA in-text citations cause students to stop the fluidity of their reading and then have comprehension issues over what they just read because that APA reading along narratively and then suddenly, bam, parentheses and an APA citation and another parenthesis affects their comprehension. There are accession numbers and codes, and some students have cognitive issues. They have visual and spatial issues, working memory issues, and slow decoding abilities. So, what can we do? Luckily, the literature had quite a few options for what we can do, and I found that there were about 8 themes in what can be done in teaching critical reading and that it can be transferred to teaching the pre-source. The first one is we have to create a safe classroom atmosphere. We have to welcome students' confusion and confessions that they don't get it. We can call it what it is. We can say, it's difficult. It's something you've probably not seen before. Let's read it together and address some of the problems. Secondly, we have to devote time to reading pre-sources in our library instruction. We need to explain the challenges, both the format and cognitive challenges that can cause difficulty in critically reading a pre-source. We need to offer support. I know that we all push individual consults and chat and librarians being available, but it might also be time to bring in the term critical reading and say that we're available for support to teach them how to critically read these difficult sources that are unfamiliar to them. Number 5, we can model critical reading methods during our instruction. And I believe we can model it when we're doing virtual chat or just a one-on-one reference encounter. Any type of encounter in which we would want to do a little bit of instruction can have a critical reading element. We need to name it what it is. It is critical reading. That phrase needs to be familiar to students so that they understand it is different and it does have challenges and it takes more attention than reading a novel. We can demonstrate thinking aloud while reading. We can demonstrate chunking, rereading, annotating, reading left to right and top to bottom, skimming, and suppressing unnecessary information. We can also counter dull subject matter. For example, if you were teaching students how to read a full record from some particular database, it's good to make sure that the examples you use are either something they've been discussing in class, something that they're going to discuss the next day, something they've recently had a test about. You can also be a little silly with it. Let's say you were just teaching in generic, some sort of first-year seminar without an academic component. You could get examples and all of them have the word funny in the title, or you could get an example of maybe a popular campus writer or a famous alum, or for example, the last few weeks, if I were teaching a generic instruction session, I might use something about the Olympics. So make sure that if you're really studying about hip mobility and things that nurses can do to aid that in a nursing home or to help with hip mobility, that might be a little dry, but you might be able to find a way to make that a little fun when you're teaching how to read these records. And then this was the most common way that professors teach critical reading of empirical research studies. They do a assignment called a sample article interrogation activity. It was all over the literature. And so we can do the same thing with pre-sources. We can create a pre-source interrogation activity, and that will encourage critical reading. And I have several examples of that later on in the presentation. And then lastly, if you can include a motivation factor. You might be able to have the professor definitely grade the assignment, the pre-source interrogation activity, or add some extra points if they finish this or complete this or make a certain grade on it. So those were the key themes that came to the surface in the literature about teaching critical reading of the empirical research article. And we can definitely use them to teach the pre-source. There are connections to the ACRL framework, and I specifically see connections in frames 3, 4, and 6. For me, the frames 3, the information has value frame, 3.5, the knowledge practices for 3.5 deals with issues of access. And if you were teaching a scope note, that's a great place to explain that these are proprietary, that the college pays a lot of money for them. They're only available through this valuable resource, and it's not free. So I can easily see how to connect frame 3 to a database A to Z list and a scope note. Frame 4, research as inquiry, that was specifically spoke to me about the knowledge practice that is 4.5. Monitor gathered information and assess for gaps or weaknesses. So they're monitoring and closely, critically reading what they have found and then identifying if that's going to meet their needs. And then definitely searching as strategic exploration. 6.3 all the way to 6.7 seem to connect to me to critical reading. There are other guidelines as well. And so in psychology, APA has guidelines for the undergraduate major. And while the word critical read or critically reading is not anywhere in those guidelines, the word read is. And 2.2, which is demonstrate psychology information literacy, it definitely speaks to critical reading. Definitely 2.2a and 2.2c speak specifically to reading and summarizing general ideas, and then identifying and navigating psychology databases. And if they are not critically reading the scope notes, they won't even know which is the best database to choose. If they don't critically read their citations and the full records, they can't tell if it relates to their information need. So I definitely see a connection to critical reading, both in the ACRL guidelines and the APA guidelines for the undergraduate major. So, what about looking at critical reading through a library science lens? If we go back to Manner and All's definition, we can take that and see how it so easily relates to what we try to teach and what we do. Identifying patterns of textual elements transfers to identifying patterns in citations, full records, and abstracts. It can also transfer to suppressing unnecessary information. I don't know about y'all, but when I'm searching a database for a student, I'm kind of pretty good at skimming. I mean, I can just skim, and I can eyeball 10 citations that are on the screen and immediately pull out the top 3 or 4 that are going to work. And the poor little student is usually a little bit lost with that. It's just something that we naturally do. But that does relate to patterns of textual element, how to necessary. Distinguishing between main and subordinate ideas is also part of the definition, and that easily transfers to distinguishing main ideas in scope notes, subject headings, help sheets, citations, full records, and abstracts. Evaluating credibility transfers to each step of the search process, beginning with selecting the initial resource to use to identifying possible sources, so relevant sources, and then eventually finding and selecting those final pertinent sources. So, how do we do this? It boils down to about 4 steps. First of all, we have to be intentional about critical reading and carry this intentional mindset through all of your instruction planning. The second step is to identify the pre-source that you think you want to teach the students, or the research problem that you want to address, and identify the pre-source that addresses that problem. Once you identify the pre-source that you're going to teach, then you identify the challenges that that pre-source brings. And they all bring different challenges. They might be an unfamiliar format, they might be quasi-narrative, they might be non-narrative, a unique layout, unfamiliar codes and numbers, fluidity stoppers, and unfamiliar vocabulary and abbreviations. And then lastly, you need to select the teaching methods that you're going to use to combat these challenges. Some of these can be addressed verbally, and others you're going to have to use demonstrations, images, screenshots, LibGuides. You could do a Camtasia video. And then definitely integrate the sample pre-source interrogation assignment. That seems to be the main sort of assessment of whether or not the student understands. It gives them an activity to practice with the pre-source, and then it also assesses if they truly understand it. So I am not a gambler, but I bet we can all use a 30-second stretch right now or time to reflect. So I'm going to take just a minute. I'm going to take a deep breath. I'm going to have a sip of water. I'm going to skim over your little comments over here, and we will be back in just a few seconds. So take a breather.
Sala, is Rebecca coming? We don't want to miss her in the,
Is this just you and I talking?
No, this is, everybody's here.
Okay. So hello, everyone. I hope you had a good stretch. So to review, we just learned about the 4 steps that we can follow to teach pre-sources. We're going to be intentional. We're going to identify the pre-source that we want to teach. We're going to identify the challenges, and then we're going to find the teaching methods that we might use to teach that pre-source. So this is an example. This is one of the easiest ones I have. Now, this screen that you see before you is not necessarily what I would show students. I just felt like it was easy to put it all together in a PowerPoint to sort of show you my thought process. So if I were to teach the pre-source, the database scope notes, let's say I was teaching for a psychology class with a focus on child development and adolescence. Instead of, zooming around through our entire 100+ database A to Z list, I would snip these and make them into a smaller image like you see before you. So obviously we have many databases in the alphabetical list between C and M, between child and Medline, but I just snipped it all into one screen so that I could teach it. Then I guess I would like to talk to you briefly about what did this look like before I started thinking about critical reading. If I were teaching this class before I began really trying to be intentional about critical reading, I would probably say something like this, and I'm just going to read you this little script of no critical reading connection. So I would say something like, so this is the database A to Z list. Choose your database by looking at the A to Z list. Databases can be chosen by the subject list or by a key term in the title of the database. Most begin with the discipline. For example, let's look at P for psychology. And then I would just quickly get the students to the letter P. We'd open up PsycInfo and bam, we're in it and we're searching. Because let's face it, we've got 50 minutes or less and we need to spend as much time as we can in that specific database. But if I could flip to a critical reading aspect of this, I might start something like this. Today, we are going to learn how to find the best resources for your information need. We are going to read something you have probably never read before. It is not a book, an article, or even a poem. It is a scope note. It is straightforward in that it is written in a narrative text, like a book, but it has some unique vocabulary that you might not be familiar with. So at that point, I would not only tell them what a scope note is, but also what is a database and what does the term proprietary mean. So these are things that, maybe I would have put them in a LibGuide. Maybe there's something the students need to learn before they come to class. A lot of it depends on what class you're teaching. Is this a semester-long information literacy class? And you can do sort of a scaffolding approach and teach a little bit. And then by the end of the semester, they've learned a tremendous amount and can use all of these tools. Or is it a 50-minute one-shot? So you're going to have to figure out how much critical reading you can teach. But just that little tweak I made by being intentional, I named it, that it is something different than they're not familiar with reading. And then we would have what I want to read up, so the pre-source, and then I would model reading it. And I would just start reading it. And then when we get to a word that they may not know what means, like, for example, this database includes all of the issues of child development abstracts and bibliography. A lot of students will look at that 1927 to 2001 date and think that the database stopped in 2001. So that's a point to make. But the key words out of these 5 scope notes that popped into me as vocabulary that they may have challenges with were issues, abstracts, indexing, scholarly journal articles, peer-reviewed, and then even the abbreviation APA. So I would figure out a way to teach that. I might define it. You could do a Quizlet, you could do matching, you could do lots of things depending on what the scope of the entire class is. But definitely the challenges with this pre-source are the vocabulary. So that's what I have to make sure that I address in my critical reading component. So the students, after I model reading the other page, and I'm going to back up just a second, I would read that aloud. I might talk to them about chunking. I might talk to them about annotating. I might could put some more bullets or clips or highlighting on the screen. There's a lot of ways to model the critical reading process. So then they would get a clean version of the pre-source. So this is the sample pre-source interrogation activity. This is the sample pre-source. And then here are the interrogation, the questions. So what is the name of the database, the pub years, who created it, who is it for, who are the users, what titles are included in it? You know, sometimes it'll tell you, like in that newspaper database, there was a list of the newspapers that were listed. Does it boast at being the largest, the best? Why might you use this database? And then this activity takes it a step further. So first, the students have the sample interrogation activity with the pre-source, sort of the use of the pre-source and what it does for them. Then after they have that understood and handled, they have an activity that actually relates to an information need. So it's stepped up a bit and they're able to use the pre-source to solve the information need. For example, if we look at number 1, information need. You must find everything you can find about clinical depression in peer-reviewed psychology and psychiatry sources. Based on the information before you, what are the best choices? Choose 2, be ready to explain your selection. So obviously in this, it would be Medline and probably PsycInfo, but you could probably give them a few points for this one. Because I gave them a hint that it needed to be medicine. So that's why I'm saying it's those 2. And I made it fairly close. I made it strict. I didn't make it just obvious. I think there's one in here about, number 3, you must find information about recent in the last 2 weeks about either homelessness or mental illness in your city or state. Well, the only one they could do is the newspaper one. That's going to be the last 2 weeks. So first they learn what the pre-source does for them and why it's useful. Then they do an activity that specifically relates to an information need. So can you guys think, and y'all can just pop them in the chat, of a pre-source you might teach that would solve a student info-seeking problem? And I'm open to ideas in all sorts of areas. You know, even history, reading a finding aid is, you know, for using archives, things like that, or art. So I'd like to see some chats. If you can think of a pre-source you might teach that solves a student information seeking problem, like the problems we discussed early in the presentation. You thinking? We good? We still thinking?
Shoot. There are a couple of comments in the chat box.
Excellent. Okay, so we will move along. So, I am not a gambler. I am a hiker. And this is a view from a recent hike in North Georgia. This is Mount Yonah. And when I got to the top of the mountain, I just looked out and I saw all those amazing mountains, the Blue Ridge, as it's called. And it just blows me away. It's so inspirational. I love it. But if you look at the tree in the foreground, that tree had the tiniest little pine cones on it. They were so cute. They were about the size of my thumb. And so you guys have heard the often quoted, people can't see the forest for the trees. But I think that our students can't see the trees for the forest. And I think they are not critically reading pre-sources. And if they would just do that, it guides them to the best sources. Oops, sorry. So how can we do this? What are we to do? We have to be intentional. And I'd like to read to you just a little conclusion. This is a web, sort of a spider web of all the connections. I believe that critical reading has to be in library instruction, whether or not it's in the classroom, whether or not it's one-on-one consults, virtual consults, LibGuides, embedded, and then feeds back into the discipline classroom. So it is all across both the library and the campus. So Rebecca and I recognize that pre-sources bring challenges to the student similar to those faced when tasked with reading an empirical research article. But we believe we must add critical reading to our instruction toolkits. Critical reading can be taught, should be taught, and must be taught. Critical reading is a skill that serves students both in the academic environment and as citizens of the world. So thank you for your time today. I'd love to have some discussion now and back and forth. I'm going to put the final slide up, which has both my names and Rebecca's email and contact information, just in case you want to contact me down the road for anything. So let's put that up there.
So thank you, Sala. If you all have questions for Sala, feel free to put them in the chat box, or you can use the Q&A feature so that we'll then read them out to her. And right now, I don't see there are more comments in the chat box than questions.
I'm going to go, if you don't mind, I'm going to, oh, maybe it won't let me. Yeah, I'm going to go up and see what all they said at the very beginning. Remember when
Absolutely.
I said I have these problems? So
Absolutely.
Yeah, this is kind of fun. Okay, we got the yoga comments. That was good for the woman that was presenting right before me.
Yeah.
Yeah, she did a good job. Let's see, we did a sound check. Okay, so here we go. All the yeses.
And I will point out that your materials are on the Sketch system. So there's a copy of the presentation slides and 2 handouts that you have uploaded to the system. So you all can find those there if you want to follow up or really delve into any elements of the presentation that were presented.
Let's see. Someone commented that they liked the idea that they had, and I said, what are some of the ideas that you would want to teach? And they said, looking at the scope notes for the ERIC subject, thesaurus terms. And Julie Hornick, I think that was, that's the question I kind of want to ask y'all. We definitely know that scope notes are the words that define the term in the thesaurus in ERIC, right? And in Psych Info, the thesaurus, if you look up in vitro fertilization, it tells you what that means and when it was introduced and what term it's used for and everything. And that's called a scope note. But I have often always used the term scope note to describe the database description that's in the A to Z list. And I'm curious, do y'all think that that has kind of aged out and that in my writing in this chapter, I should refer to that database description as a database description and not a scope note? What do y'all think about that? Like, what do y'all call your little 2-sentence database description in your A to Z list? I don't know.
There's lots of stuff coming in now.
Okay.
A database description. So I've never heard the term scope note before, and I've been a librarian for 14 years. I used to say database description, if only for clarity. Honestly, I'm not familiar with scope note term. And someone said they call it a blurb.
Yeah, I think I'm going to need to change that in my writing because I've been a librarian for longer than 14, and we definitely used scope note way back in the day when we had to read dialogue, blue sheets to go online to search, and it would have a description of the database, and it was called a scope note. So I think I'm going to switch that to database description. So that, yeah, and then definitely the term scope notes, like Tori Kellogg is saying, that, you know, scope note is the word that's used in the MESH subject heading in the thesaurus. So as not to confuse people, I think I'm going to switch that pre-source and call it a database description in the upcoming chapter. And then I will use someone said, oh my goodness, dialogue. Erin said that. That dates me, doesn't it? So someone said that, yes, someone might confuse scope note with cliff note, but that might get their attention, you know. Yep, we use dialogue in library school, and I remember it being scope note when those blue sheets, you know. But anyway, I will change that. So I'm talking about that pre-source, that database description. But as I get to further along in the assignments, I do talk about a scope. I think I talk about a scope note in the thesaurus. So I need to distinguish that. So, how's it going? Do y'all think you teach critical reading, and do you think you would be interested in integrating it into your instruction sessions? I think y'all are probably tired. It's the end of a long day at a conference.
There's some comments in the chat box too.
Okay, excellent. This is the first time I've ever done this, so I appreciate y'all bearing with me. The book will be coming out in the spring of 2022, and at this point, the teaching PowerPoint that I have on this conference website, again, it's more of just my ideas. And that's something the editors pointed out to me in the most recent revision. They were like, well, we see the teaching things, but you haven't really explained to us step by step how to do this. And I realized I had it all in my head, but hadn't really explained it. So the next sort of step for me is I'm going to be putting them into Project Cora. Are y'all familiar with Project Cora? And it will go in there. And a lot of the chapter authors from that upcoming book have put their materials in Project Cora. So what you kind of have are just sort of the ideas, not necessarily the actual, what I would actually use to, you know, I wouldn't necessarily show students the little blurb with the vocabulary on it. I would teach the vocabulary another way, but that's kind of the way I organized my thoughts to begin the preparation. I do think that each instruction librarian has their own methodology of what they like to teach and what they want to use. And I didn't want to be so specific in that, well, now you have to do this and now you have to do that. I just wanted to give you the ideas of the things that needed to be taught. And then you would be able to put your own spin on it of how you want to teach it. Let's see. Linnea, the term critical reading sounds kind of confusing. I agree. When I first started doing this, all I could think about was critical thinking. I could think about critical thinking and active reading. Critical reading, just kind of, you know, what is that? There's a very full bibliography in this conference presentation, and you might want to read some of those. It was really helpful. And the critical reading, the Manarin book, super helpful with critical reading in academics. Mm-hmm. And I agree with Tori. Yeah. Yes, critical thinking and critical pedagogy. Yep. That's the kind of thing that I was trying to wrap my head around when I was writing the draft for this chapter. And I'm still wrestling this chapter in place. So I'm hoping it's going to be good when I'm sure it will be. The editors will hold us through that. But there's still some revising to do. And I don't think Dr. Aker has joined us, but she is a big proponent of instruction at our institution and is the co-author on this chapter with me. And, you know, with the times and the pandemic, if I haven't heard from her, I just haven't pushed. You know, when you don't hear from people, you just kind of have to let things go. But she is my co-author and is part of the chapter.
Okay, does anyone have any questions? If not, we can go ahead and start. Oop, there's a question. I know as soon as I started wrapping up, someone would have a question. Awesome. This is there a specific reason the professor wants primary research articles as opposed to the peer-reviewed we are usually asked for?
Excellent question, Margaret, and I'd be happy to address that. It threw me for a loop at first because I had been working with psychology students for years, and I was a psychology liaison at Emory, and I had never heard a professor say primary research article. I always teach them how to limit to empirical studies, and, you know, they're good to go. She only wants the primary research articles because it has something to do with the process she is using to teach them how to analyze that data. And she says that as undergraduates, they are not skilled enough yet to analyze secondary data. That's her reasoning, and she's a stickler for it. And some of the other professors, like Rebecca, she doesn't limit it to that. And I think Rebecca even lets them, I think it's Rebecca, one of the faculty lets them use dissertations so that they can see how to lay out a literature review, or use dissertations to glean citations from the bibliography. But the other one doesn't, and very strict on that primary research articles. Have y'all heard that used in the psychology field? Yeah. Well, that's what I think too, but she doesn't. She takes it a step later. Yeah, and Dana, you hear it in nursing, I see. I thought she meant original research article too, but she, you know, you could have original research using secondary data. So an example would be that when like suicide, when they study teen suicide, so much of that data is from that U.S. national survey. And then the authors are analyzing that data and putting their spin on it. And she doesn't want that. So it has something to do with her particular assignment that she's doing with teaching them about data. And she might let them use it in some other context, but not this particular one that they're always asking about. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I don't see any more questions, so we'll go ahead and close out. And but first, we want to just thank you for doing an amazing presentation. So let's give Sala a round of applause for an amazing presentation and for sharing your expertise with us today. There's a lot of good comments in the chat box, so I know that people really found it valuable. And then go ahead. Oh, and to you all, thank you all for coming today, and for engaging and for being present and mindful in the sessions. We really appreciate that. And so we're also going to, you know, at the end of the conference, send out an evaluation form, and we look forward to hearing your feedback, so that we are able to make this first conference only be just the beginning of, you know, what we hope to be an annual instruction conference. But, you know, in the midst of me saying it, I think I saw another question come in for you. It says, what part of the study did you enjoy the most?
I'm sorry, what part of what?
What part of the study did you enjoy the most?
In writing this chapter, that particular, is that what they're talking about?
Gail, is that what you meant? She said yes.
Yeah. You know, I kind of liked all of it. I do more creative writing. I write historical fiction picture books. They're not published yet. They're manuscripts, but I enjoyed kind of pulling together the creative process of the chapter to make it interesting and not just dull and dry. I actually have a quote in there from the romantic comedy You've Got Mail. And so I just kind of silly, but you'll see it. Hopefully the editors will keep it in there. But I enjoyed that creative process, and I had way too much word count, and I had to cut on this second part. So I really enjoyed it, and I enjoyed learning about critical reading, because I'm with you. I critical thinking, critical pedagogy, active reading, critical reading, but it really, I get it now. So just pulling out, doing all the research and reading and doing the creative aspect, and it'll be my first chapter, so it means a lot to me. And I really enjoyed all of it, and the editors have been wonderful. They're very positive. They know how to give you the critique that makes it stronger, but still be positive. And I really like that. So, it's not actually a quantitative, it's not a study, it's a chapter with activities in it. But I've really enjoyed the whole process. It's been fun.